The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
We have always been very clear that we prefer a negotiated solution. This remains the case, and we will use the time that we have now till the 1st of August. And on the second track, since the very beginning, we have worked and now are ready to respond with countermeasures.
Ursula von der Leyen speaking as Donald Trump announced 30% tariffs on exports of European goods into the US.
Yeah, we are sort of right back where we started in terms of our trip to tariff land here. If anything, for some countries it's even worse. We have the Trump administration talking about bringing back really steep tariffs on Canadian goods, Brazil getting hit with a 50% tariff despite the kind of trade surplus there. You have tariffs on copper, you have looming pharma tariffs. It's been a long time since we've delved into the topic of tariffs, or what feels like a long time in reality. Only been a few weeks. It seems like a good time to dive back in. It's Jonathan.
And it's Amy, and this is the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that delves into the knottiest business, economics, and finance questions. So, Jonathan, I think you said it very well. We're kind of back to where we started. But again, a looming deadline over the world, August 1st, where we're waiting for, I guess, these tariffs to kick in, right?
Right, that's the thing. It's funny because I feel like almost in order to make it look like this isn't just doing the same thing again, it was framed less as a deadline and more as a this is going to happen, right? Trump started just posting out of nowhere all of these letters that were supposedly sent to heads of state around the world on Truth Social, his social media network. All of these kind of formulaic letters saying, we're very unfair terms of trade between the US and your country. We're putting in a tariff that, again, as happened back on Liberation Day in April when we saw very similar tariff rates promised, is kind of framed as we're being merciful. This is only half of the size of the trade deficit between the US and your country or what have you. I'm guessing the mood in Europe is that, this is more of the same where we're back to just like, okay, we have another deadline now and negotiations are continuing, right?
Yeah, but definitely earlier this week, I think when he announced the 30% tariffs on Europe, I think that was seen as quite unexpected, given that the last thing we heard before that came out was that Europe was in a sort of constructive negotiation with the US. So for that to kind of change and shift in that way, I think makes people, I guess, even more worried about what is to come. But thankfully, we have Neil Unmack, who has been looking at Europe very, very closely. He is an editor at Breakingviews, and we have Gabriel Rubin as well, who is our Washington-based columnist, who has also been looking at things from the US side. So we will have a lively debate about, like, kind of from both sides of the Atlantic, which I think is kind of helpful. So Neil, if I could start with you this week, and I'd love you to just kind of tell our listeners, for those behind a rock who didn't see what happened in Europe, what exactly happened with Trump and the 30% tariffs, and how was that announced, and how did that all kind of come about?
Sure. Well, essentially Europe and America have been locked in negotiations ever since April the 2nd, when Trump announced the Liberation Day tariffs, and Europe's tariff rate there was expected to be 20%. Since then, the assumption has been that there would be some kind of deal that would see that rate fall down to 10%, and then possibly some other deals on specific sectors. So possibly something on cars, or possibly something on steel, or possibly something on drugs. Although, and what looks increasingly clear is that while the expectation on the European side was that they were going to come out with some deal like that, the Trump administration wanted something that was really very threadbare, i.e. that's probably the 10% rate and probably not much else. In other words, high tariffs for cars, drugs, steel, etc. And so the fact that Trump has come out and threatened them with the higher rate of 30% clearly shows you that the two sides are quite far apart on where they actually wanted to go. It's also possible to see Trump's actions as a sign of desperation on his part, because America has only negotiated 3 or 4 trade deals since April.
I think that's being generous to the nature of what's been announced, right? We had
yeah. So
we had the
like,
deal. we had the deal with Vietnam announced, but we've seen actually nothing signed. We've seen reports that like even Vietnam was like taken aback by the rates that were announced by the Trump administration. There to them, there wasn't even like a number attached. So like I don't even know like if it's too early to say like this is a sign of desperation or whatever, because it almost seems like they don't want to get across the finish line. Like, I realize that's not what the messaging is, but at a certain point you have to kind of wonder like if they keep pulling the rug, like isn't the point to pull the rug? Like I don't know.
Well, and of course the UK trade deal that they agreed, the Americans have already effectively defaulted on one key part of it, which was they haven't made good on the steel element of that, and Trump indicated lately that he wanted to revise that steel element. So all of these trade deals are really just pieces of paper, and how long they last is another matter. But coming back to Europe, I mean, of course, and of markets, of course, there was a sort of assumption that everything was sort of gliding towards a series of delays and ultimately ending up around 10% or possibly 15%. And this sort of concept of the taco trade that Trump will always kind of chicken out. And it seems like we're still quite away from that. There'll need to be a lot of shouting and a lot of noise before, even if we end up in that place, it's still going to take quite a long time.
I was just sort of curious, Neil, as well. So if you're Europe in this situation, so you've been kind of caught off guard, you've got this August 1st deadline where things will be essentially enacted or come into force, let's say, for the tariffs. What are Europe's options at this point?
Right. Well, I mean, if it comes down to Europe being hit with a 30% tariff rate and further tariffs on top of that on key sectors like pharmaceuticals and cars, that will clearly be very, very bad. I mean, I think the sort of analysts' estimates are about a 1.2% hit to GDP over the next year and a half. The US is Europe's largest trading partner. Its key exports, Europe's key exports are the ones that are really going to get clobbered, particularly pharmaceuticals and cars. So I think there's still a huge incentive for Europe to agree some kind of deal. Of course, if Trump does really offer them a terrible deal and threaten the 30% tariffs, then Europe will need to respond in some way. They've already outlined two kinds of responses. They've outlined sort of tariffs on about 20 billion of goods, which are in response to the steel tariffs, and then tariffs on another 70 billion, which are in response to the Liberation Day, April 2nd tariffs. They can do a lot more. They can hit the services sector. America has a huge services surplus with Europe. They could increase taxes on digital services, on the likes of Meta or Google. And I think if it comes down to it, Europe will have to move in that direction, even though it's a very difficult thing for them to do.
That's the thing I wonder about, right? Because I know, Gabe, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it doesn't feel like the US strategy has been tested in that way yet. And kind of like the initial skirmishes thus far, you saw Canada pull back on its digital services tax. You saw a couple of other things that are maybe like tiny little victories for the Trump administration. Like right now, there hasn't been like big concerted pushback, except for obviously one big case we'll set aside for the moment, China rare earths. But like in terms of this bigger, like I guess services argument that Neil is talking about, like, do we have any template for thinking about how that might play out? Or
yeah, it really seems like so far we have just seen carrots in this negotiation, at least from U.S. trading partners, with the very large, important exception of China, obviously. But really, Canada, of course, pushed back rhetorically. Mark Carney essentially won his election as prime minister, as a result of his pushback against Trump, his sort of elbows up slogan. But, as you said, Jonathan, then they went back and offered to roll back the digital services tax on American companies. So we've seen a lot of carrots from U.S. counterparts. But as Neil is outlining, if the U.S. goes ahead and imposes a 30% tariff on the European Union, retaliation will be, the primary option that they have, given that, at that point, trade negotiations would have already failed. So something like a digital services tax, something like, all of the options that Neil just outlined, will quickly come into play, and this could get very ugly very quickly.
I mean, what I find sort of interesting is that, it's a very brave thing for America to pick a trade war with the rest of the world, because every country that a lot of countries like Europe have very, very large trading exposure to America, but ultimately it's just one trading partner. Whereas if every country in the world retaliates simultaneously, America has no exports. So America is a lot weaker, I think, than perhaps Mr. Trump realizes.
But I was sort of wondering on that exact point, because if you think about like the UK, so they've kind of ended up with this like 10% tariff, and there's all these different numbers. And is the sort of thinking that it would be difficult for there to be like safety in numbers, like all of these global trading partners to sort of come up with retaliatory measures together? Because you're sort of hoping that actually, 10%, 20%, that's not too bad. We can manage that. But actually, if this gets much worse, we can't really manage that. We can't not have the US as a proper trading partner. And I guess, Neil, I guess that's to you. And Gabe, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I think there is obviously an incentive on the part of all of these countries. If they can get a slightly better deal than the one that, say, China has, then they'll be okay. And that, I guess, is Trump has been playing them off. But he still only has three, three half-baked trade deals so far. So that strategy is not working terribly well at the moment.
Yeah, I think that in a sort of zero-sum world, you would expect. I mean, U.S. consumers are not simply going to become ascetics and live in the woods and not buy any consumer goods. They will still buy them. There will be demand from countries with lower tariffs. Production will go to countries with lower tariffs. Obviously, transshipment, meaning things that originate in China but are then sold or imported from another country. That's going to be. It's already a gigantic issue. It's going to get even more so as global trade becomes more fragmented. So, I mean, the type of coordination that would be necessary just seems really difficult to organize on a practical level. That sort of institution, everybody but the U.S. To negotiate, trade amongst themselves and then deal with the U.S. separately. I mean, that doesn't really exist. I mean, the closest thing we have, arguably, would be like the EU negotiating as a bloc. But
I also just wonder the
yeah.
degree to which, again, and I realize I keep harping on this, but the idea that finished trade deals are even the metric of success or not for the Trump administration. Like, I don't know, at a certain point, you have to wonder, like, why these things get endlessly forestalled and endlessly changed. Part of that is clearly they are making up a lot of things on the fly. But, you kind of look at, for instance, the transshipment issue, right? And that suddenly came into like all of these like form letters that were being sent out, as I mentioned, to all of these heads of state saying, oh, we will put a higher tariff on anything we deem to have been transshipped through your territory from China or what have you. And I mean, look, you look at what's happening with China's kind of like current account numbers and whatnot. It is clear that like goods are being pushed through kind of like other markets at the moment. Like, where those end up, who knows? But like long term, I guess what I wonder is like, isn't it almost in the US's interest to like keep this as a sort of Calvin Ball situation where you have all of this stuff constantly up in the air and you keep applying pressure because the nature of like how these goods flows, how these capital flows are all going to rearrange, like it's not going to be a one and done, oh, we got X concession out of a bunch of countries and they ordered Boeings or whatever. Like, that would be almost like the kind of like easy way out for the administration, right? Like there's this bigger question of, oh, if you are actually serious about, Chinese trade balance with the rest of the world, like you almost kind of have to keep this in a fluid situation where everything is constantly changing, right? I realize this is giving a lot of credit to the strategic positioning of an administration that has jumped around a lot, but like, is there something there?
So I'll take the other side on that, and I would just say that like the incoherence of this strategy suggests that Trump really just likes trade wars. And I no, I mean I don't even mean that in sort of a flip way. I think that he really enjoys reorient, having people come offer him, a 50 plane purchase from Boeing, or come offer him, well, oh, don't put tariffs on us. We'll rescind, our digital services tax. I think there is a certain sort of reestablishing, America's role on the global stage that he feels he's playing. And then I think that actually cannot be understated in terms of his motivations here, because if you actually had a coherent strategy, you wouldn't be getting rid of, all the industrial policy that the Biden administration put in. I mean, like there is a coherent way to sort of, deal with the threat of China in manufacturing and trade, but simply picking a fight with all of your trade partners and then keeping it in the air. And for our listeners who haven't read Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin Ball is essentially a game in this comic strip, this American comic strip, where the rules change every single time. You know, you like run around that tree and that's 5 points, and then you fall into the quarry and you lose 3 points. That's essentially how Trump is running this trade war, with no sort of coherent outcomes that are visible, except, you know, some purchases of Boeing planes.
But the impact on the American economy is just starting, right? So
Yeah.
we'll see. We saw the latest inflation figures were quite, you know, gave a sort of glimpse of that. But surely it's going to get harder for him to wage this kind of perma war
Yeah,
as the American
definitely.
people
I mean,
start to experience it.
Yeah, so the consumer price index for June came out this week and showed 2.7% over the past year, which of course on its own is not that scary, but it is a tick up. And you know, you're starting to see some pressure on goods inflation, specifically related to, you know, to consumer goods, furniture, toys, clothing. I mean, that's where you're starting to see pressure. And you know, that's where do those
But then
things get?
remember what Trump said, you know, maybe you don't need 10 dolls, maybe you need $1. And so
Exactly.
maybe
Exactly.
the goods inflation isn't such a problem if you're thinking like that. Um, I mean, one thing I was sort of curious about, Gabe, because we've seen some very interesting tariff announcements. What would you say has been like the most shocking? Because
Uh,
Brazil is sort of coming to my
yeah, no,
mind, but
I think Brazil, just because, I mean, to the extent that it broke the template of these other sort of out of the box announcements. I mean, I realize out of the box announcement, but there is a template, sort of as Jonathan said at the beginning. You know, many of these things, sort of these letters, took on the sense that they were sort of form letters. That Trump didn't have a specific beef with Laos as opposed to Cambodia, but Brazil, he has a very specific issue, which is the ongoing legal travails of former President Jair Bolsonaro, a far right figure who attempted his own insurrection in Brazil following his election loss to Lula, the current president. So Brazilians are understandably extremely angry about this, because it is Trump inserting himself into their legal process, into their political process, and the U.S. has a trade surplus with Brazil. And just making this insane, and you know, a 50% tariff on Brazil would be just horrible for Brazil, and it's all done in service of an old political ally who attempted to disrupt democracy. So I understand why they're angry, and I understand that has no place in trade policy.
Right. And I mean, the kind of funny thing is, like you say, if we're entering into further and further uncharted territory in terms of how these things are being used, and if the Brazil broadside is kind of an indication of what could be to come, is it kind of weird that we haven't seen the market reaction yet? Like, again, like, you know, the S&P index keeps notching new records. We're totally back from the initial tumble out of bed that we had post Liberation Day in April. There's just like no reaction function, like holding back the administration at this point, right?
Yeah, not. I mean, the bond market, arguably, you know, bond yields, especially long-term ones, have been above 5, you know, and have ticked up, have shot up during the Trump administration. But that's clearly not, you know, some people thought that, and myself included, thought that would provide a check on Trump, that he would sort of reconsider those things. But that's really not. I mean, maybe if bond yields really shot up, far beyond 5, you know, there might be some sort of reaction. Certainly, there would be more pressure from Wall Street and from, you know, American consumers. But no, I mean, at this point, the market really seems to just be betting on the taco trade, the sort of Trump always chickens out trade, which at this point I don't think is that good of a bet, just because, you know, the U.S. tariff rate at the beginning of the Trump administration was hovering around 2 or 3%, the average tariff rate. And at this point, it's, you know, closer to 15%. That's a huge change. And this is during the so-called pause. So, you know, there might be a really rude awakening come August 1st.
so it's Calvin and Hobbes, Gabe, another nice visual and analogy for us that the game changes. You have to adapt. But I feel like, Jonathan, we're going to be back here the first week of August.
Yeah,
trying
fundamentally,
to make sense of this again.
we could be doing this every week.
I'm
so,
clearing my calendar.
Yeah.
Put it in your diaries, folks. Well, listen, Gabe, Neil, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Cheryl Pena in New York and Gregory Garner in Toronto. You can listen to a new episode of The Viewsroom every Thursday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. And don't forget to tune into our sister podcast, The Big View, every Tuesday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you heard, please follow The Viewsroom and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.